we live?
You're good, Mark.
Okay, yeah, Andy Lockwood says you're live. Okay, we are live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the office hours for the User Experience Research and Design courses, the MicroMasters. I'm excited to meet you all, as it were. I've been very happy to be able to offer the MicroMasters courses and to teach the first three in the sequence. Hopefully you guys are enjoying them as well. I've really enjoyed seeing the discussion posts, seeing how you guys are dealing with the material and kind of applying it to some real world situations. I've enjoyed looking at the assignments that you guys have turned in throughout the various courses. I see that many of you are engaging very deeply with the course material and really mastering the content, which is very exciting and gratifying for me as an instructor. So yeah, I'm here to answer questions. I've got a few questions that came in through the edX forums. And then I'll be looking at the chat if you guys have questions you want to ask live on air. But I thought I would start with something from the forum. So we have a question here from Bethany Reebok. She says, "Hello. I joined the MicroMasters program after learning about it from a classmate who also recently left an online UX bootcamp after a poor experience. I'd love to hear more about that and how it compares to the MicroMasters." Bethany says, "I'm now focusing my energies on participating in the MicroMasters and would like to thank Professor Newman, yay, and the team for providing an excellent learning experience. A few questions for consideration. First, after reading through the MicroMasters page, it's still unclear to me how potential transferable graduate credit works. Can you please clarify?" So yes, this is a question that several people have asked through multiple channels. How exactly does this MicroMasters thing work in terms of transferable credits? The answer is, first of all, it's important to understand something about the way universities work. Sometimes it can be can take a while to nail down details of something like this. This is a very, very new model for the university. And to do things like nail down the number of credits that somebody's going to get through taking, essentially a non-traditional path into the program has turned out to be just sort of slower than we anticipated, because essentially the faculty all need to agree on the details and so on and so forth. Okay, that's a long-winded way of saying we don't know yet exactly how many credits the MicroMasters will sort of count for if somebody ends up enrolling in the residential master's program. We know that they will count for some credits, at least a couple of courses, possibly more than that. But those are details that need to be worked out by curriculum committees and so on and so forth. So that level of detail has not been worked out, other than to know that there will be some transferable credit. There was a question, it's not this question, but another question that was asked elsewhere on the forums was, how would this work for other institutions? Is it possible to transfer MicroMasters credits to other places besides the University of Michigan? And the answer there is that we don't know. It's entirely up to each institution whether they would accept these as academic credits that would count towards residential programs. They can. It's entirely up to them. It's very similar to decisions about transferring conventional course credit, and each institution has its own policies around that and what counts and so on and so forth. So all I could say is I would encourage you to reach out to the admissions departments of other institutions that you're considering applying to and ask them how they would deal with something like this. My guess is that will be a new thing for them, and they'll have to think about the best way to approach it, because this whole MicroMasters phenomenon is fairly new, and we think it's going to be a model that's going to become more common and more prevalent in higher education. But a lot of institutions are really just trying to wrap their head around this, how this whole thing's going to work, including the University of Michigan, although we're probably farther out in front of most institutions because we've now launched several MicroMasters in multiple areas, including this one, UX Research and Design. So some ambiguity still. We do have folks in the admissions department at the University of Michigan School of Information who will be happy to answer questions that you have about that and give you more specific advice about timelines for applying for the program and what transfer would look like, and so on and so forth. I don't have the contact information handy, but we will post it in the comments or in the chat after the office hours. Okay, Bethany also asks, what are key projects of a portfolio for a UX beginner to focus on developing while taking the MicroMasters and preparing for the capstone? So this question about portfolio is very interesting and very important. When you're thinking about how to take what you're learning in the MicroMasters and use that to communicate with potential employers, and what employers really want to see more than a certificate or more than a list of courses that you've taken is examples of the work that you've done. And throughout the courses in the MicroMasters, we've tried to provide opportunities for you to start building up your portfolio in the sense of giving you examples of work that you could potentially package and show to an employer. You may want to take some of the work that you've done in the MicroMasters courses, things like the micro usability test in the first course and the sketch assignments, heuristic evaluation in the principles of designing for humans, use the more elaborate usability test in the evaluation course, and then some of the design work that's being done in the courses that are being rolled out right now. You may want to polish them up. You may want to, take them a little bit farther than, sort of the minimum that you may have tried to do for the courses, and start to collect those as examples of how you've engaged with real sites, real problems, and so on and so forth. The capstone in particular is really designed to provide you with a solid portfolio piece that you can use as a showpiece to highlight your skills and to communicate with employers and so forth. So the question was, what are the key parts and projects of a portfolio? It's kind of hard to say, which ones you should not worry about, but it does depend on, to some extent, on where you want to place your emphasis. So the MicroMasters is called UX Research and Design to highlight the fact that they're really kind of those two dominant paths in the UX field. And there are multiple ways to sort of put a career together in UX. It's common for people to specialize in either design or research. And then there are people who choose to do a kind of hybrid and go back and forth between research and design. If you see yourself more as a researcher, this would be somebody who spends most of their time trying to understand users and understand user needs and map those into requirements for a system. What does a system need to do in order to meet those needs? Well, then your portfolio is probably going to emphasize more of that research work. It's going to emphasize things like usability test reports that you have done, of tests that you have done, needs finding reports like you will have the opportunity to explore in the Understanding User Needs course, which will be launching this summer. that will be more emphasized, which is not to say that the design work, the wireframes and prototypes and things wouldn't be important as well, because a researcher needs to understand how design is done and how research contributes to design, but you probably want to emphasize those research components. On the other hand, if you see yourself more interested in design, more interested in working on the prototyping aspects of UX, clearly you're going to want to focus in your portfolio on developing those designs. Again, research is still important. You need to justify why you did the designs that you did and why you made the choices that you made. But you're probably going to emphasize those design artifacts, those prototypes, those mock-ups and things like that a bit more. Okay, let's go to the chat. There are a couple more questions from the forum that we can come back to, but let's see if we have some questions in the chat. It looks like we are starting to get a few. Okay, James McBennett says, I told my Uber driver about this course and he said he would sign up. Awesome. Okay, here we have Anne. I live in an area where we have a very strong program with on-campus classes and respect in the area. I'm wondering how an online class would compete in terms of looking for positions. I think that's a great question. I think there's, this kind of comes down to how are employers going to regard this MicroMasters, the UX Research and Design MicroMasters. As I said earlier, this is a fairly new concept in education. Employers are going to be, more familiar with conventional degrees, master's degrees, and things like that. And they will have probably had experience with other people who've had similar types of training and therefore have expectations about what they can do and what they are bringing to the table. And with the MicroMasters, at least initially, this, you guys, the first kind of group to go through this, in many ways, you're going to establish the expectations that people have about what somebody with a MicroMasters can do. And I think most likely the work that you're able to produce and that you're able to show is going to communicate a lot more than the credential, but we are doing what we can to promote the MicroMasters, to get the word out. We are working with employers to make sure that what we're providing is what they're looking for, trying to better understand how to communicate with employers, what the advantages of these things are, and so forth. So, clearly a conventional residential program is the safer route in terms of being able to communicate clearly and concisely with employers about, what it is that the training provides. But it's also a much, much larger time commitment, much more investment of tuition dollars and effort and things like that. I will say that in terms of developing the portfolio, you don't have to restrict yourself just to the work that you do in classes. And this is the same thing that we tell students in our residential programs. Look for opportunities to do this work outside the classroom or outside the class structure. One idea that I often recommend to students locally, and that I will recommend to you, is look for organizations in your community that could use some help, right? There's lots of nonprofit organizations, churches, schools, other organizations that are not going to have large budgets, but are going to need to have ways of communicating and interacting with their clientele, their customers, their supporters, their volunteers, or whatever it is. Many of these organizations probably have a website of some kind. Maybe they even have a mobile presence or app or something along those lines. But in many cases, these things have maybe not been designed professionally. They maybe just sort of threw something together, and they could benefit from a volunteer approaching them and saying, hey, would you like me to take a look at improving your website? And you could lay out for them, Here's how I would go about doing it. I would understand, do some research to understand better what your users need, what your clients and customers and your constituents need. I would generate some different design concepts to provide better support and better services to them. I would prototype and so on and so forth. To actually build the website, you obviously need to have, either access to the technical skill to be able to do the programming and the building of the website, or you need to work with them to find the appropriate people to do it. But even in cases where maybe that last step is not possible, it's an opportunity for you to help them understand what it is that they need better and to create something that you can use in your portfolio. So that's an avenue that I think is very promising, is looking around in your community with people that that work at different types of organization and say, hey, is there anybody that could use a hand with this kind of stuff? Volunteer your services and build up your portfolio that way. Okay, let's see what else we have here. Okay, so Daniel asks, what can we expect from the capstone project? Well, that's my summer project, is figuring out exactly what that's going to be. But the basic idea is that we will present the learners in the capstone course with a general design problem. We need to develop an app or a website that accomplishes some particular need. What that need is the part that I'm still working on, because my goal is to actually engage companies, one or more companies, to provide those design prompts, so that we're actually working on real world problems that are the kinds of things that you would encounter out there in the workplace. With that design prompt, essentially, the capstone will provide a set of milestones and a set of checkpoints to go through the process of essentially starting from a general problem to understanding better what the user needs are, to generating possible design concepts, to prototyping those concepts, and then evaluating them to figure out if they indeed solve the problems that you've identified in your early research and solve the broader problem as originally stated, and then using that information to improve and refine the prototype. The goal will be to produce a very well-designed, well-crafted, well-reasoned, and well-supported prototype of a design that would solve the original problem. But doing that by going through the entire sort of iterative user experience research and design process. So I'm very excited about the capstone. I think it's going to be an opportunity for the learners, for you guys that have gone through all of the courses, that are really have decided this is something that you want to invest in, that you want to spend time in. It'll be an opportunity to get really much deeper into it and have a more full and complete experience with seeing a UX project all the way through from the beginning to the end. Okay, question, what are the minimum requirements for taking the class? This comes from Dabo. There are no minimum requirements for taking the class. This class is designed to basically start from scratch. So anyone is welcome. Okay, I see, this is Alex. Alex, LOL, what? Hello from LA. I see a lot of synergies in UX with knowing visual design and UI. Do you see some value in also knowing some development? For example, in web, knowledge of HTML, CSS, JavaScript, etc. Absolutely. I think that there are lots of people in UX who don't touch any programming. But if you have that ability to actually build an interactive prototype using state-of-the-art technologies, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, then your value is that much more increased. There are some employers who expect some degree of front-end development capability from their UX designers. There certainly are career paths that don't require that. But I think it's a great skill to develop. It's obviously not part of the MicroMasters. There are other online options for doing that. In fact, the University of Michigan offers a Coursera specialization called Web Design for Everybody that's taught by my excellent colleague, Colleen Van Lent, that I think would be a great place to go to learn those kinds of skills in parallel or at some other point to complement the UX skills. Wendy Bravo, is the Capstone project going to be a mobile app? That's a great question. I can imagine this depends in some part on who I'm able to recruit as corporate partners. My sense is that the problem statement will be broad enough that one of the questions might be, is this problem best addressed by an app or by a website or by some other type of designed product? I mean, it could even potentially be a physical device of some kind, although my guess is we'll probably stick with apps and web. So maybe, we'll see. I'm not quite sure. I'm still working out the details of that. Let's see, what other online courses would you recommend to learn more of the UI and visual design aspects? That's a good question. I don't know of a good online. I definitely think that one of the things that we start to get into in the UX research and design MicroMasters, but don't go maybe as deeply into as some of you might enjoy, is the graphic design, the detailed, the craft of really creating great visual designs and experiences and things like that. I'm not presently aware of a top-notch graphic design online course. I might just not be aware of it because it's frankly not really in my area. I tend to focus a little bit more on the in my own research and teaching on the research side and on the technical side. I'm not a particularly skilled visual designer. Maybe you can tell from my slides that they're not the most inspired visual designs that you've ever seen. I think that would be a great question to post on the forum on edX and see if other learners have ideas about online courses for graphic and visual design, because I'm just not aware. All right, I'm going to go back to the forum. We didn't quite finish Bethany's questions. Well, this next question is kind of similar to the question that Wendy just posed on the chat. Do you have any specific recommendations or additional resources outside the program for a career transition into UX? Yes, I do. UX is a huge and growing field, and one of the nice things about UX professionals is that they're very active on the web. And so there's lots of great websites and blogs and resources and things like that that I would recommend for you guys to check out. In addition, there's a bunch of there's a lot of books, and I've actually brought some of my own personal collection that I will share with you in a moment. I'm just gonna. I think this is something where I will post a list. I just kind of grabbed a list. I'll post a list later, but maybe I could go through with the help of Andre here behind the camera. I could take you through a couple of websites that are ones that I often point people towards that are great resources for kind of tracking and monitoring stuff that's going on in the UX field. All right, so let's go to the screen share. And okay, here we are. Okay. So one of the oldest, and well, I don't know if it's the oldest, but one of the one of the I guess best resources. So if you've taken the the Principles of Designing for Humans course, or if you're starting to take that, you've heard me talk about Jakob Nielsen. And Jakob Nielsen is, one of the sort of great names in UX. He's been active since the 90s and, was a real pioneer in, what was back then called usability engineering, and has kind of, gone through several changes, and is now what we refer to as UX. Whoops, that's not what I wanted. But he actually teamed up with Don Norman, who's one of the other great UX people who we also talked about extensively in the Principles of Design for Humans and in other courses, to create this consulting group, the Nielsen Norman Group. And they have basically, Jakob Nielsen has been creating UX articles and blog postings since the 90s, very, very early in the web. And the stuff that he and now his colleagues write about is just great. And I refer a lot to postings that come from this. And so if you go to the Nielsen Norman Group website, you can just you can subscribe to their blog. You can just check out what they're doing and read their articles and announcements. And they obviously have lots of other stuff going on, but that's the articles is the stuff that I think are really important. Another very well-known and I think influential online resource for UX is the website Boxes and Arrows. So they don't post as often, but their articles are great. They have lots of different prominent UX people that are writing different articles and things like that. It started out as a resource mainly around information architecture. That's why it's called Boxes and Arrows, because when you're trying to figure out how to organize information on large websites, you end up drawing lots of boxes and arrows. But it's really progressed, and it covers lots of topics around user experience research methods, user experience strategy, professional tips and tricks, and so on and so forth. And there are many, many more. In fact, if you just search, best UX blogs or, best UX websites and things like that, you will find dozens of recommendations that I think can be a really great start. And I strongly recommend that you pick, at least 3 or 4 of these sites and sources to follow on a regular basis, just to get a sense of what are the issues that people are talking about in UX. What are the trends? What are the new problems? How are people dealing with changes in technology? How are people dealing with, shift to mobile and wearable technology, and with the increasing prominence of intelligent systems and services? So things like Alexa and Google Home and the Apple's new product that they just announced. And so how are people dealing with these types of things? Many of which we're not really getting into that much in the UX MicroMasters, because we're really focused on kind of the basics and getting you up to speed with the basic techniques and approaches in UX research, and not so much how the technology landscape is changing. Are we back to... Back to me. Okay. So here, there's lots and lots of books that I think are very good. So we've got Don Norman's collection of books. So we've talked in the Principles of Designing for Humans. We went through many of the concepts that were originally outlined in the Design of Everyday Things. Classic book. It goes all the way back to the 80s, but very much still relevant to user experience, and I think something that honestly every UX person should read, and probably even non-UX people. He wrote several books. He's written several books since then. Emotional Design, I think, is a great kind of update to the Design of Everyday Things, bringing in kind of the emotional aspects of how people respond to products on different levels, and not just from the usability perspective. This book is the book that we actually use in the at University of Michigan in the course that's called Needs Assessment and Usability Testing, Usability Evaluation. That's what it is. I've taught that course for about 7 years. So yeah, you would think I would remember what it's called. But anyway, as you can see, this one has a big stain on it because I've also used it as a cup holder. But Observing the User Experience by Liz Goodman, Mike Kuniowski, and Andrea Moed. This is a great methods book. It goes through user experience research methods from interviews to contextual inquiry to usability testing, surveys, focus groups, and all of these different kinds of things. It's really the methods Bible that we use at the University of Michigan in the residential program. And so I definitely recommend this as a great thing for getting deeper into the ins and outs of usability testing, interviewing, and various things like that. To follow on that, if you're doing a lot of usability testing or preparing for a serious kind of large-scale usability test, the Handbook of Usability Testing by Jeffrey Rubin is a really practical guide for the ins and outs and the details of usability testing. I've seen several questions on the forum about, what do you do in this situation, or what do you do in that situation, or how do you interpret a user comment or a user error and things like that. And all of that is in this book, like how to deal with these different kinds of situations that might arise during usability testing. How do you prepare for it? How do you interpret? How do you report the results and things like that? So there's much more depth than we really have the opportunity to go into in these online courses, and this is a great resource for getting more deeply into it, especially if you're going in the direction of user experience research and you see usability testing as being a big part of how you want to put together your profile as a UX professional. And I'll just mention one more. This is a classic, Alan Cooper's About Face. This is About Face 3. It's the 3rd edition, which I think is still the most recent edition. I could be wrong about that, but it's the one that I have. And the first part of the book talks about methods, design methods, and understanding your users and ways of representing your users through things like personas and scenarios, which are things that we'll get into in some of the design-focused courses in the MicroMasters. But then the back 2/3 of the book are really very thoughtful and thought-provoking ideas about how to think about user experience and how to design systems that people will use, sort of high-level principles and things to think about when designing and so forth. And there are, again, just like with the online resources, there are dozens. I'm tempted to say hundreds, but I think dozens is a safe statement of really excellent books about user experience. And again, I would just encourage you to search, to search Google, Amazon, and look at what people are recommending for books about UX research and design, and you will find lots and lots of stuff out there. So part of preparing yourself or kind of thinking about moving into this profession is, going beyond the courses and starting to engage with the broader profession, see what kinds of things other professionals are talking about, what they're sharing, and so on and so forth. You might be able to find professional meetings in your area. This really just depends on where you are and where people are active. So at least here in the United States, the User Experience Professionals Association and the UXPA and the Interaction Design Organization, IXDA. Many of them have chapters, especially in the larger cities. I'm not totally sure if those organizations are active internationally or if other countries have sort of parallel organizations. But if you start, again, to look for professional associations in your area, many of them have weekly or monthly meetups. They will have speakers from the local area talking about different topics in UX. Great way to meet people, and again, a great way to find out about kind of what's happening in the field of UX and start to connect with some of those things. And All right, let's go back to the chat. Okay, here we have Anne. I am trying to transition from technical writing to UX, having had no experience in the latter. Oh, did I already answer that one? Okay. I'm not sure I did, but I'm not sure. I'm very cognizant of how I can compete as a novice. So I think it's kind of asking the question of, how do I break in? And again, I think the main thing is you really need to produce a body of work, and you need to be able to talk to people about how you produce that work, and kind of how you use the techniques and theories and concepts of user experience to justify the designs that you produced. Is it too late to start the MicroMasters program? Absolutely not. And do you get an edge when applying for the master's program at the University of Michigan? That's a great question, and the answer is you get special consideration. So you still need to, demonstrate that you that you can do the work, and that you are engaged, and that you are hardworking and conscientious and thoughtful, and so on and so forth. But the advantage that you have if you do the MicroMasters as preparation for admission to the residential program is that we consider the body of work that you produced in the MicroMasters as part of your admissions package. So in essence, you have an additional way of communicating to the admissions committee about what you can do and what you're capable of that other applicants wouldn't necessarily have access to through the more conventional means of applications like the essay and the transcript and so on and so forth. So especially for people that are maybe making a career transition, that maybe don't have what would be a conventional kind of looks good on paper type application, the MicroMasters, I think, is an excellent way of demonstrating what you're capable of that would complement whatever your sort of standard traditional record would communicate to the admissions committee. Okay, the way that this scrolls is confusing to me. Okay. If I'm accepted to the MSI program in Ann Arbor and are working through the MicroMasters program currently, are there any important requirements, deadlines I need to be aware of for the school year? That's a good question, and I don't know the answer. I think I need to direct you to the admissions folks at the MSI program as far as the deadlines. Yeah, I'm not really aware of the admissions deadlines and exactly how procedurally we're going to be dealing with the MicroMasters into residential program. That's something that our admission staff would be able to help you with, though. Okay, so Dan says, I know a number of people who work in UX. All the ones I spoke to place an emphasis on the portfolio rather than a certificate of course completion. What value does the certified status offer? Well, I would say that, there's a couple answers to that. One is the opportunity to complete the capstone, which is something that we are only making available to verified learners and people that are working towards their certificate. That's going to be a smaller group, we expect, of people who are engaging in it, which is going to provide us with the opportunity to give more, to have more interaction with the learners through between the teaching staff and the learners. I think that the portfolio, as I've said before, is extremely important. I think if you combine the portfolio with a certificate that communicates that how you've learned this stuff, and connects it to the work that you're able to demonstrate in the portfolio, I think both of those things can work together to show a picture to the employer that I think would be more powerful than either one of those things alone. So that's my opinion. This is something that we will, of course, be testing in the marketplace as we start to produce more and more of these MicroMasters certified learners who are going out there and talking to employers and hopefully giving us feedback about what sorts of response they're getting. Okay, I was on sabbatical from work for around 10 years. How easy or difficult will it be for me to get employed by studying UX design? I have a prior architecture background with 4 years work experience. So, I mean, I think that you're doing the right thing, right? I mean, by kind of getting back into getting back into it, following a structured program like the MicroMasters to kind of take to develop a new skill set, produce a new body of work that will hopefully communicate what you're able to do. I think that the connection with architecture is actually quite strong. I mean, I've known a lot of people who have bridged that gap from architecture into UX design. In fact, there's a whole subfield of UX design and research called information architecture because of the connections, in some sense, between those two fields. You're the type of thinking that you need to do when designing buildings and structures for that are usable and make sense to people and support the kinds of work and lifestyles that people have are similar in many ways to the kind of thinking that you need to apply when designing software and interactive systems that support people's work and their goals and things like that. Obviously, employers will have questions about the 10 years and so on and so forth, and that's kind of independent of the path that you take to get back into the field. But I think that the MicroMasters is a great way to kind of get back into that. You can decide as you go along whether pursuing a more formal form of education is the right path for you, or whether you're able to kind of use the MicroMasters certificate in addition to work that you do kind of outside the classroom, the online course structure to get where you need to go. And several people said that was a great question. Hopefully I've given some at least useful ideas in response to that. Okay, so Alex suggests hack design, weekly UI UX lessons emailed to you over 52 weeks, a lot of visual design stuff. I do think that there's a number of opportunities like that. There's another one called the Daily UI Challenge that I've looked at a little bit. And this one actually gives you a design prompt and encourages you to address the prompt, draw a sketch or draw a storyboard or something like that, and then post that maybe via Twitter using a certain hashtag and things like that. You can see what other people have done in response to that prompt and start to, get your, in some sense, test your ideas against other people's ideas. And it's a way to, not only sharpen your design skills and kind of get more comfortable with how you approach different types of problems, but potentially give you some pieces that you could develop into portfolio pieces that you could then share as well. So I think opportunities like that, I'm not actually familiar with hack design in particular, but the one I'm familiar with is the Daily UI Design Challenge, and both of those I think probably sound like they would be good opportunities. Okay, Diogo asks, are there any tips for tools on UX projects such as Axure, InVision, etc.? So in the design courses that my colleague Peja Klasnia is teaching, at least one of which has been launched so far, and I think the other one is getting ready to launch, there will be discussion about those and some opportunity to try out some particular tools. I do know that Axure, InVision, Balsamiq are probably the most well-known and the most commonly used, at least by the UX designers that I have interacted with. But there are lots of them, and there's new ones all the time, which is yet another reason to check out some of these websites and blogs and see, how people are reacting to these. You can find reviews of these different products. It can depend on what specific type of design you're doing. Are you aiming for web? Are you aiming for mobile? Are you aiming for desktop installed software? And people have their preferences. It can also depend on what your prior experience is. If you know Adobe products really well, you might choose InDesign because it's going to use a lot of the same techniques, and it's going to integrate well with Photoshop and Illustrator. If you're starting from scratch, it might have a higher learning curve than some of the other things, and so on and so forth. They all the kind of best, well-known UI prototyping tools ultimately get you to the same place. It's just a question of sort of which features work best for which individual and what type of project you're doing. Okay. When mentioning research and evaluation, do you refer to qualitative or quantitative research? What are the common research methods and tools we typically use in UX research? We use a lot of different tools and techniques in UX research. I will say that, I think the world is trending towards a combination of quantitative and qualitative research. The quantitative research that you see in UX, so you'll often see surveys, which are ways of getting sort of a very broad snapshot of how a particular population or a particular set of users thinks about particular things. Essentially, what are their attitudes? And it could be attitudes about your product. It could be attitudes about a product category. You can get sort of high-level characterizations of the behaviors of users. How frequently do they do things? What sites and products do they currently use? And this can be extremely valuable for guiding decisions about design going forward. On the quantitative side, probably the most common technique that's used are analytics. So after a product has been launched, whether it's a website or an app, gathering data about how people are using it, what paths they're following through the product, and so on and so forth, is essentially a standard practice. But of course, you need to have a product with users in order for analytics to be meaningful. So in many cases, when you're designing a new product or you're making significant changes to an existing product, you're going to be dealing with small numbers of users, and qualitative methods are going to be a lot more effective, and quantitative methods are frankly not going to be practical in many cases when you're at that early design stage, when you're trying to decide between multiple different design concepts. You want to be able to iterate rapidly before you decide on a design direction and invest heavily in it. And so you need, as a UX researcher, you need to have mastery of the qualitative methods, such as interviews, observations of work practice, or what people currently do, and the qualitative aspects of usability testing, where you're trying to observe how people are using a prototype, maybe a system that hasn't been fully developed yet, and trying to, figure out, is this design working for them, and where is it failing, and what needs to be improved, and so on and so forth. There are, especially in larger organizations, so like a Google or a Facebook or an Amazon or something like that, where you have a very large UX function. There might be, thousands of UX researchers and designers in the organization. You sometimes see specialization. So I know that at Google, for example, they have different job titles for quantitative UX researchers and qualitative UX researchers, and so some people really specialize. If you're at a smaller organization, or you're working, as a as a contractor or a consultant, you probably are not going to be as specialized. You're going to need to be able to sort of pull different things out of your toolbox to solve the problem that's in front of you, and that's going to generally require a mixture of qualitative and quantitative methods. So the question is, can you add your recommendations to the course handout section or a more appropriate place if available? Yes. So I did mention some URLs and some books and things like that, and we will find a way to make that available in a more permanent way. Okay, for clarification, the capstone is available only for verified learners of all previous, I believe, 8 courses. That is correct. So for the capstone, the capstone is really, not meant to teach new material, but to give you a guided experience through applying the material from the previous 8 courses to a realistic design problem. And so we are restricting access to the capstone to people that have completed the verified certificate for all 8 of the previous MicroMasters courses. And then the capstone, completing that as a verified learner, is required for getting the MicroMasters certificate at the end. Question, do most UX designers specialize as healthcare or industry specific? I would say most probably don't. There certainly are exceptions, and there are, UX people at, in particular industry sectors, in automotive sector, the healthcare sector, you name it. And so those people probably, they do learn a lot about that specific sector, kind of what works and what doesn't, what the standard practices are and things like that. And then that can give them an advantage when working in that particular domain. But there's a lot of UX researchers and designers who work quite broadly. And it's one thing that some people really love about UX is that you get to learn new things all the time. And this is more true probably if you're in a consulting type of arrangement where you're working for different clients and you need to, sort of figure out what this client needs and then deliver for them. And in some cases, you might be in a situation where, you're working in healthcare one day and you're working in, retail the next day, and you're working in supply chain the next day. Not the next day, let's say the next 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks, but where you're switching gears, switching industries quite a lot. And so, the stuff that we focus on in the UX, in UX education in general, are really the methods and approaches and concepts that apply no matter what your domain is. Obviously, if you go into particular domains like healthcare, there might be specific regulations that you need to become aware of and so on and so forth. But most of those you can kind of pick up relatively quickly on the fly. So I would say it's more common for UX researchers and designers to kind of switch among different topic areas. At least I would say that's true of a lot of the alumni of our programs, as I hear from people a lot of stories about how they, switch from one to the other. And it's one of the things they actually like about pursuing this profession, is that they're not locked into one thing. Comparing UX versus UI, do you think I have to have a good knowledge of both areas? This is Phil, by the way, of both areas in order to get a job opportunity, or only UX will do? How are those two areas related? I'm not totally sure I understand the question, but if the question is, I'll answer what I think is an interesting answer to the question. So you can think of UI as being the specific, the layout of the visual screen, or the specific features, and really ties into the specific technologies that you're using. And so in order to build a user interface, you need to use, build it for that specific platform. So if you're building a web interface, you're going to be using HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and so forth. If you're building mobile, you might be using Swift or Java or something like that at the end of the day. right? And then UX is really more about the understanding the user aspects of it. So, Phil, hopefully I've captured what your question is. So as I said, I think in response to an earlier question, wait, it's not Phil, it's Plinio. Sorry, I misread that. I'm sorry for mispronouncing your name. And probably I'm not saying it right either. But anyway, it is good to have knowledge of both. It is good to have some technical ability to take something all the way through from sort of the concept to a working system. It's not that common for people who are in UX research and design to also do the sort of hardcore engineering to build a robust kind of roadworthy system that can be deployed to, say, thousands or millions or billions of users. Those are generally different skills, the engineering that's required to build sort of the robust systems. But having the ability to, have some mastery of user interface technologies can be helpful for building essentially more realistic prototypes that can be used in a wider variety of different situations. So I'm not sure if I've answered that question. In some sense, UX and UI are deeply overlapping concepts, but and I recommend knowledge of both if you can make it work. Okay, recommendation for usability.gov, UX design guidelines, method strategy. I also recommend usability.gov. I think they have a great collection of resources. So thank you, Veganize, for that recommendation. Are there deadlines for quizzes, tests, or assignments? No, this is self-paced. We do place a restriction on we do dictate when the course needs to be completed, which is a year after you start it. I would recommend going faster than that. We have designed the courses so that each lesson should, if you go kind of at, what you might think of as full speed, which is, sort of commitment of 3 to 5 hours a week, you can complete about a lesson a week. That's kind of the way the courses were designed, is thinking about the lessons as being about a week's worth of work. But you don't have to do them that fast. If one of the advantages of online learning in an environment like this is that you can engage in it while living a life, having job, family, and all these kind of things, which are sometimes harder to do when you're enrolled in a residential program and have to make sacrifices. And so we've designed it to be flexible and kind of let you go at your own pace. We do want you to finish within a year, though, because we've found through other courses that have been offered at the University of Michigan that it's helpful for people to have some structure around it, and that people that are going to take longer than a year, probably is going to be better for them to start over and redo the course from scratch. How are we doing on time here? So we've been at this. Now it is 2:30. Okay, well, we can keep going for a while. Let's see how many more. Okay, we're getting towards the end of what we have. Right now you have about 5 questions still left on chat that you haven't answered yet. Okay, let me see if there are ones from the forum. I don't want people that ask questions early. I don't want them to lose out just because we have some questions on the live chat. Okay, here's a question. JZ Miles asks, in regards to weeks 2 and 3, this is referring specifically to the intro course. Can you offer advice on how to proceed when users are failing tasks simply because they are skipping steps or seem confused by the script? I'm hesitant to be too descriptive in the tasks because I don't want to lead users. But at this point, I'm worried that I'm testing the test rather than Doodle. I tried leaving the script as well as adding a bit more priming, reiterating at the beginning of the test, et cetera, et cetera. This is an excellent question, and it's gets into kind of the details of usability testing and sort of some of the gray areas that you'll often run into. It is very common to discover that the instructions that you give in a usability test are not perfect. That people are confused by the instructions, that they miss the details that you're trying to get at, and so on and so forth. And it can, it can vary a lot by the population that you're testing, the details of the individuals that you're testing, and so on and so forth. So it's very hard to give a blanket answer to this question. I will say that if you find that you're running into issues because of your instructions, it is a good idea and recommended to clarify those instructions on the fly. Now, it can be difficult to do that without sort of giving away what it is that you wanted people to do. And sometimes there's no way around it, and you just kind of have to write off that particular task of that particular test and say, maybe I'm not really getting any value from that, which is one of the reasons that we often that we always test with multiple people, with as many people as we can, realistically, usually at least 5 to 7. So in the micro usability test, in the first course, the point of that was really just to give you as the learner a sense of what it's like to conduct a usability test. We typically wouldn't do a usability test with only 2 users. And we also typically wouldn't do a usability test without piloting the test first. Now, we did pilot the test before releasing the instructions for you guys to use, but you may find that those instructions don't work for you because they're not in your voice. They're not in the way that you would communicate. And you may find that you need to adapt them for your own particular style or for the population of users that you're working with. I mean, so we tested it with, sort of folks that we could find here at the University of Michigan campus, and they're going to be different from people that you might find elsewhere. And so a couple things just to get out of that. One is that typically when you do usability testing, you will run at least a couple of pilot tests, which are essentially test sessions that you plan to throw away, that you're not actually going to get usability information out of, but you're going to use to debug your test script and to debug your interaction with the users so that you can make sure that you're getting the most value out of it. And then you'll debug and kind of refine your test script and then run your formal participants separately from that. But you will develop kind of a taste and a sense of how to adapt on the fly when you realize a user isn't understanding what you ask them to do, or they're skipping ahead, or they're skipping steps, or they're not actually going towards the goal that you have assigned them, and you want to kind of gently nudge them back onto the path, and so on and so forth. So it's another reason also why having more chances to do these kinds of research methods outside the MicroMasters structure is really helpful, because you start to develop your skills of how you work with users, how you work with the instructions in order to get the most out of these tests. Okay, then. A couple more questions about deadlines, which I think we've already addressed. Okay, here's a 4-part question from Sev0518. So I have a couple of questions specifically relating to the 504X, which is the Evaluating Designs with Users course, but also applies to really, I think, any usability testing section, usability testing scenario that you might find yourself in. First question is error types. Do you report errors made by participants when they subsequently corrected their mistakes without any help from the moderator? These are errors participants committed by mistake without meaning to. Do you see a difference between this type of mistake and true errors? That's a great question. You will often, and this gets at really the qualitative aspect of usability testing, where you as the test administrator and as the interpreter of the results really has to use your own judgment about whether something is a problem or not, and also recognize that it's not a binary decision. It's not, often it's not the case that, the task was a complete failure or a complete success, but there may have been some struggles. And that may indicate that there's a problem with some aspect of a particular of a site or a product, but you might say, but it's not a critical problem. It's just perhaps an annoyance or something where, even though this person was able to recover from it, you need to ask yourself, do you think that's going to be a bigger problem for other potential users, and so on and so forth. Definitely, it's the case that an error that somebody later recovers from is, you would probably read as less severe than an error that actually leads to an inability to complete the task. And so reporting these things with that kind of nuance is often something that you'll need to do when communicating the results of a user test to whomever you need to communicate it to, the product owner, the product designer, or whoever is going to be the one taking action on the results of your user test, which in some cases is going to be you if you're doing this as part of your own project. And you need to ask yourself, okay, how big of a problem was this? You might end up with lots of problems that are not critical, and those might be at the bottom of your priority list, and they might be things that you just don't end up having time or resources to address. And that's actually not that uncommon, is that you have a lot of kind of low-level cosmetic or sort of slight annoyances that you identify, but that don't really make it to the level of something that needs to get fixed, or at least is not high priority. So I think similar to that task success, I found that some tasks were not entirely completed successfully by some participants. Their results were different from the answers we were provided. I believe the differences stem from the fact that participants can either choose, this is getting into the details of the particular site that was addressed. This was the Hipmunk website. There are different options. They could choose city or airport. And the question didn't specify which airport the participants should pick. I think this is another example of needing to exercise judgment in deciding whether somebody was successful at completing a task or not. And the ultimate test for something like this is, is the user going to have an outcome that is successful from both the perspective of the user, they feel like they got what they needed, but also from the perspective of the system. Did the system, did they achieve the goal that the system needed the user to achieve? So in the case of an online travel booking site, it's in the interest of both the user and the site to make sure that users are successful at completing a booking that they are happy with. It may be that the user doesn't end up with an optimal choice, right? Maybe they could have found a slightly better flight at a slightly cheaper price, or slightly that was at a better time of day or something like that. But if they're not aware of that and they're happy with the choice that they made, then maybe we would consider that a success. Maybe they would be even more happy with a better outcome that might lead to greater satisfaction down the line, more likelihood of using it in the future. And so as somebody who's reporting the test results, you might say, well, this was a success. However, it fell a bit short of sort of an optimal result. And you might suggest ways of helping users achieve that optimal result. So again, this is getting at this issue that errors and success and so forth in usability testing in particular are often not black and white, but there's often some gray area. And as a UX researcher, you will learn how to navigate that gray area and communicate sort of the important information, which often is, well, it kind of worked, and here's what worked about it, and then here are some places where it maybe fell short, and here are some places where it could be improved. Again, obviously, those places where it could be improved a little bit are probably going to end up being less important than the places where an improvement is required for users to accomplish some very basic tasks that they need to be able to do. As you end up with this range of issues at different levels of priority, rather than just a simple list of problems and non-problems. Okay, and then we have some more questions about the relationship of the MicroMasters to the master's program on campus, which I think we've also addressed. So I'm going to go back to the live chat.
Okay, so with the live chat, we've got a few people, primarily questions about sort of about course structure, it looks like. So we can start off with the one that we have right here at the top. This question is where we left off last time.
Which one?
This one right here.
Oh, okay.
Deadlines for
Okay, we talked about the deadlines, yeah. So, okay, what's happening if we fail a specific course? Can we try again and complete the course to get the certification? I actually don't know the answer to that, but I think the answer is yes. Let me find out about that, and we'll figure out a way to get that information to you. But I believe that that's essentially a question that has mostly to do with how edX structures course enrollments and things like that. I believe that's the case. I believe it should be the case, but I will have to do some research on that. What type of resources or paths would you recommend for students who want to focus on UX research? Maybe specific courses, areas of focus practice. Thank you very much. The courses in the MicroMasters, well, I guess one thing I would say is that even if you're focusing on UX research, it's very important to understand how UX design works, because as we've talked about in many of the courses, well, probably all of the courses, hopefully, these are tightly interwoven. The standard practice in UX is to interleave research with design activities. Now, that said, it is common for people to end up specializing in one or the other. So I would say the courses that talk specifically about UX research that are in the MicroMasters, the Evaluating Designs with Users, which really focuses on user testing, Understanding User Needs, which really focuses on formative research or understanding what the requirements for a system are. The survey course, which is looking at for broader sets of users and wanting to get a snapshot of how a large set of users or potential users would think about things, or how they behave, or what their characteristics are. And then the UX research at scale, which looks at kind of the quantitative side of assessment of systems that are being used by people, and your goal is really to optimize them for the particular user population. Interviews, user testing, surveys, and analytics are, in some sense, the core UX research methods. There's lots of different flavors of those, lots of different versions. There's different types of user testing. Sometimes you are doing more summative user testing. You want to design it more as an experiment with a control condition and an experimental condition, and you want to make quantitative statistical arguments about how well a system performs, and sometimes you want it to be more qualitative. You might do user testing at scale, using remote methods and so on and so forth. But understanding the basics of what you're trying to get out of a user test is fundamental, and really like what we focus on in the MicroMasters. Similarly with formative research with users, you can learn about users by interviewing them. You can learn about users by observing them. You can use other methods like diary studies to get people to report in an ongoing way, how they're pursuing particular activities that you might be supporting with your system. But they all kind of come down to the same basic stance of trying to understand what user practices are and what, how users navigate the things that they're trying to do. And so as far as the resources or paths, I mean, I think that the MicroMasters gives a very good introduction to the core methods and approaches that are used in UX research. And then you can take that and continue to develop by reading books and reading blogs and articles and things like that to see how these methods are being used in different situations for different populations, for different systems. So you can start to understand how to adapt the basic knowledge that you would obtain through the MicroMasters to different types of scenarios that you would find yourself in. One of the benefits of the MicroMaster credential is being able to pursue an accelerated and less expensive master's degree, yes. How long will the credential be available and valid in the universities? That's a good question. I don't know, at least a couple of years, but I think we haven't established. I would say that in essence, at this point, we are still trying to understand how the MicroMasters relates to the residential program. We're very excited about seeing the first couple groups of students matriculate through the MicroMasters and into the residential master's program so we can better understand what the nature of the preparation is from the MicroMasters into the master's program. We expect that there will be tweaks and there will be refinement of how that whole process works over time. So I don't think we're at the point where we can guarantee how long the credential will be valid. So if you finish the MicroMasters now, can you apply in 5 years to the master's program? That's a great question. Clearly one that we need to work out from a policy perspective, but I don't think we've worked that out at this point. I think it's safe to say it'll be valid for a couple of years. But I think we have not established the duration that it would be valid. And we might not be in a position to do that until we have a better understanding of exactly what the nature of the path is. Do you foresee that some people will do 10 MicroMasters as a master generalist rather than the traditional master specialist with a single master's? I guess some people might do that, although I don't think that's going to be a standard path, and I don't think that that is necessarily something that employers are going to find appealing, because I think that one of the advantages of something like a MicroMasters is it does offer an opportunity for somebody who, in many cases has a background, an educational and professional background in some other field to pivot into a new field and gain the skills that are required to get started in that field. I think if you do MicroMasters in lots of different areas, it will probably be less valuable than focusing in on a particular area and pursuing that and developing skills in that particular area. I think there is an emerging sense that people will change careers multiple times in their lives. And we think that MicroMasters are going to be a great way for people to do that. But we don't expect necessarily that somebody would, do lots of different MicroMasters at one point in their life and then, go forward from there. It would be more likely that people would do maybe a MicroMasters or a couple of related certificate programs in a particular area, work in that area, and then maybe 5 or 10 years later say, hey, I want to go do something else now, and then kind of pivot using the same technique. Okay, yeah. Thank you, Veganize. All right, so it's some answers to some previous question. Okay, bye, Anne.
Well,
Say hi to your daughter.
With a question.
Oh, does she? Okay.
So, if we get some more updated comments here.
Okay. Yeah, maybe you can point me to the things that look more like questions.
All right, so right here, Ann comes back with a good question about sort of how's course grading going to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the courses, I mean, essentially each assignment is graded, and then there's a percentage threshold that's required for passing the course. At this point, there's no more nuance to it than pass or fail. So there are no A, B, etc. It's simply if you reach a certain point threshold, you've passed the course, and if you fall short of it, then you haven't passed the course. And as I said earlier, I need to look into this, but I believe you can retake the course for credit again later. But so no A, B, it's pass fail.
This question is similar, but it's about the capstone.
Yeah, so will students get feedback from professors on their capstone project? The plan at this point is to definitely have an instructional team that will be composed of the professor who's leading the course and probably a team of student instructors, graduate student instructors that we will recruit from the University of Michigan and provide feedback from that instructional team. So moving from the peer feedback model that we have in the courses leading up to the capstone to an instructor-led feedback. By the way, that model of the professor working with a team of graduate student instructors is the model that we use for all of our on-campus courses as well. And so we'll be applying a model that's more like that for the capstone. The details have not quite been worked out. There may be some areas where, especially for maybe smaller assignments and things like that, where we still use some amount of peer feedback, but the goal is to have instructor provided feedback for the significant milestones in the capstone. Okay, the last one is, are there any software used for UX research? I'm hesitant to say no, but I think that UX research, okay, there's different types of UX research. So for things like analytics or analyzing how people are using existing sites and apps and things like that, yes, there are tools. The most commonly used is Google Analytics for websites. If you're working with a mobile app, usually mobile analytics all analytics requires instrumenting the system with some code. Different platforms provide different levels of granularity and so on and so forth. So for analytics, yes, there's definitely software tools that people use. Most of these tools have built-in analysis tools for visualizing, slicing and dicing the data and so on and so forth. For usability testing, in the evaluating designs with users course, we have encouraged you to use screen capture software so that you can go back and review the test sessions later. And so those are tools that are used. There are more sophisticated versions of screen capture software. The best known is probably Morae, M-O-R-A-E, by TechSmith, which provides not only the screen capture and the video of the user and the audio, but also will give you analytics about when users clicked on different buttons and things like that. And so there are tools for usability testing. There's also tools, Morae and other products that provide better support for remote usability testing. So you can actually be in a different physical location from the person who's your test participant. It will provide, mechanisms for communicating with them, for recording, for allowing other people to observe the test, and so forth. For other UX research methods, like interviews and so forth, I mean, typically people use just fairly generic recording technologies. They may use, sometimes there's software packages for qualitative analysis of audio and transcript data. So if you're doing a lot of interviews, if you're interviewing like dozens of people for a large project, it can be difficult to deal with all of the data that you get from that. So there are tools. NVIVO is a qualitative research tool that a lot of people use to organize large sets of data, to look for themes across different interviews. And there's other similar products to NVivo. Atlas TI is another one that's well known, and things like that. Yeah, so I think those are probably the main tools that are used. But I will say that much of UX research is done with pretty generic tools: audio recordings, text files, maybe the occasional Excel spreadsheet. But it's not as tool heavy as the design side of UX research. I think that's all we have for today's questions. This was fun. I hope it was informative and productive for all of you out there in YouTube land. Oh, is there one more question?
Yeah, there was a question asked about an hour ago that we sort of missed in the
show.
Oh. It's by Devin. Let's see if I can pull it up.
Sorry, Devin. Missed it. Oh, I see. Yeah. How many courses would you recommend someone take at one time within the MicroMasters program? I would recommend one or two. I don't think you should do more than two. I think two is manageable if you can make the time. I mean, each course sort of states what the expected time commitment is. Most of them are 3 to 5 hours a week. I've tried. The instructors have tried to keep it at that. It can vary a little bit. Some weeks are a little heavier than others, and so on and so forth. Since they are self-paced, if it turns out you've overcommitted, you're not necessarily going to get yourself in hot water. I think if you do more than that, you run the risk of not really being able to engage with the material as deeply as I think would be valuable for getting the most out of it. So I think in general, probably 1 to 2 courses at a time would be desirable. There is some extent to which the courses build on each other. They're not deeply prerequisite driven, but I think if you take the courses in order, we've sort of designed it as a narrative that builds to some extent. It'll be more valuable to do that way. But I think as far as concurrent courses, 1 or 2 is probably about the best. Okay, did we get them all?
Yep, that is the last of the questions, and just a lot of thank you messages. Vicky has complimented you on your shirt.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. This has been great. And I look forward to seeing you guys on the forums and at future office hours, which we will do again at some point.